The morning was cold and gray, a stark contrast to the warmth I had once felt in my husband's embrace. I sat in the sterile lawyer's office, my fingers nervously tracing the edge of the envelope in front of me. It was as if the air itself had thickened, suffocating me with every breath I took. My hands shook as I carefully slid the envelope open, trying to prepare myself for the contents inside. My mind raced. What could it be? The house we had built together, the savings we'd worked so hard for, the family we'd dreamed of. Surely he had left it to me, hadn't he? For 15 years, we had shared our lives together. We had our ups and downs, of course, but we always managed to find our way back to one another. Our marriage had weathered storms, and I thought we were finally in a place where everything felt secure. My husband, John, was my partner, my best friend, the man who had stood by me through thick and thin. I believed that we had an unbreakable bond, one that even death would not sever. The lawyer's voice broke through my thoughts, his voice smooth but professional as he began reading from the will. To my beloved ex-wife, Carol, and her family, I leave all my possessions, including the family estate, the savings in our joint account, and the heirlooms passed down through generations. The words felt like a punch to my gut. My heart stopped for a split second. I could barely comprehend what I had just heard. His ex-wife? Carol? Why was she still so present in his life? How could he leave everything to her and her family after everything we had been through? I struggled to keep my composure, the will in my hands now trembling. Everything? I asked weakly, my voice barely audible. The lawyer glanced up, his face unreadable, and nodded solemnly. Yes, everything. I stared at the paper in disbelief. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process the reality that my husband had left it all behind. Our house, the life we had built together, and even the money we had saved for our future. It was all going to Carol and her family. My mind raced, trying to find a reason, any reason for this decision. Hadn't I been the one there for him in his final years? Hadn't we talked about our plans, our future together? All those promises, those moments of love, seemed so insignificant now. Why? I whispered to myself, though I knew no one could answer. The lawyer looked at me with a hint of sympathy in his eyes, but there was nothing he could do. It's all according to his wishes, he said, his tone apologetic, but firm. His ex-wife and her family were the beneficiaries. You were not included. I couldn't understand. My husband had always been there for me, supporting me in everything. We'd fought through hardships, supported each other through losses, and planned for the future. And yet, in the end, he had left it all behind for the family that had been in his life before me. My heart felt hollow, as though the foundation of everything I had believed in had just crumbled beneath me. The minutes that followed were a blur. I heard the lawyer's voice continuing, but the words didn't register. It was as if the room had grown muffled, the air thick and suffocating. I tried to speak, to ask more questions, but no sound seemed to come out. Instead, a single question consumed me. How could he do this? I could feel the tears threatening to fall, but I held them back. I wasn't sure why. Was it pride? Or perhaps just an overwhelming sense of betrayal that kept me from breaking down? The man I loved, the man I had spent years of my life with, had chosen his ex-wife's family over me, his current wife. I wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but all I could do was sit in stunned silence, clutching the will in my hands. I left the lawyer's office that day in a haze, the words of the will still echoing in my mind. I walked aimlessly through the streets, feeling the weight of my husband's decision crushing me. I had thought we had something real, something lasting. But now, I was left with nothing but questions. Why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't he trusted me with his plans? Was I just a footnote in his life? As I walked through the empty streets, the overwhelming sense of abandonment sank in. I had been left in the dark, in a world where nothing felt certain anymore. My husband's death had already left me reeling, but this was the final blow. The shock of the will, the reality of his decision, was something I wasn't sure I could ever fully come to terms with. Everything we had shared, everything we had built, seemed to mean nothing in the end. I was just another part of his life. He had left behind, a memory fading into the past, while Carol's family would carry on with everything he had left behind. I didn't know how to move forward from this. All I had now was the cold, empty space he had left behind, and the painful knowledge that the life I had known with him was now nothing more than a memory. The days that followed my husband's funeral were a blur of sorrow and disbelief. I had lost John, the man I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. And now, I felt as though I had lost even more. The will, his decision to leave everything to his ex-wife's family, only deepened the wound. It wasn't just a financial blow. It felt like a betrayal on every level. My world had shifted so suddenly, so violently, that I didn't know where to stand anymore. I spent the next few weeks in a state of numbness, going through the motions of life, but feeling detached from everything around me. The house we had, shared together, now felt like a foreign place. Every corner, every room held memories of John. Our laughter, our shared moments, our dreams for the future. And yet, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum of the life I had. Lost family and friends came and went, offering their condolences. But I couldn't bring myself to truly connect with anyone. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand why John had made the decisions he did. His death had already been a cruel shock, but his choice to leave everything to Carol and her family was a cut I couldn't heal from. Carol, his ex-wife, had always been a presence in our lives. Even though she wasn't physically around all the time, she had been part of John's past, and I had always been aware of that. Their marriage had ended years before we met, but there was always an underlying tension. She was the mother of his children, and despite everything, John had always maintained a cordial relationship with her. I had never minded that. In fact, I had admired the way they had managed to maintain an amicable relationship after their divorce. But this was something else entirely. I couldn't help but think back to the many times Carol had come over for family events, birthdays, and holidays. She was never really gone from our lives. She had an easy way with John, a familiarity that I sometimes found unsettling. I had convinced myself that it was simply because they had shared so much history, but now, in the wake of his death, I wondered if that history had never truly left him. Perhaps that was the reason he couldn't cut ties with her family, because he felt obligated to them in a way I had never fully understood. At first, I had tried to push these thoughts away, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. John had always been the kind of man who struggled with guilt. He had a big heart, and he had always been determined to make up for past mistakes. I had seen that in the way he cared for his children from his previous marriage, how he always made sure they were taken care of, even when they were no longer living under his roof. But I hadn't realized just how much his past would continue to shape our present. It wasn't just Carol I had to contend with, but her family. They had always seemed to hold a quiet, unspoken power over him. I had tried to push that aside as, well, telling myself that they were just supportive ex-in-laws, but now, in the wake of John's death, their presence felt suffocating. They were in the house more than I was, making plans, taking control of decisions that I thought should have been mine to make. Every time I turned around, it felt like they were there, taking over what little space I had left. I had expected grief to be the hardest part of losing John, but it was the feeling of being replaced, of being made invisible in the life we had shared, that was unbearable. I felt like a stranger in my own home, surrounded by people who had once been distant, now suddenly claiming what should have been mine. It was as if the past had come rushing back to swallow me whole. The funeral had been difficult, of course. The outpouring of grief from everyone around me was overwhelming. John's children from his first marriage had been heartbroken, and their grief was palpable. I had tried to console them, but my own sorrow often overshadowed my ability to comfort them. It was as if all of us were stuck in a fog of emotions, mourning the same man, but with different understandings of who he had been. As I sat in the empty house late one night, staring at the photographs of us hanging on the walls, I couldn't help but feel like I was being erased from the narrative. John's family, his past, they were all still here, carrying on as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, I was left with nothing but a life I had to rebuild from scratch. The most painful part, however, was the fact that John had never shared any of this with me. The decision to leave everything to Carol and her family, the reasoning behind it, none of it had ever been discussed. I was left to piece together the fragments of his life, trying to understand what had gone wrong, what had led him to make such a painful choice. In the end, I realized I might never know. And that, in itself, was the hardest pill to swallow. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself sinking deeper into a state of numbness. The world outside continued its course. People went to work, the sun rose and set, the seasons shifted. But I felt as though I was trapped in a place where time had stopped. John's death had already shattered me, but the decision he had made in his will seemed to carve a wound so deep that it felt like a part of me was missing, as if the essence of who I was had been stolen. The house, once filled with the sound of laughter and love, now felt eerily silent. I couldn't bear to stay in our bedroom, surrounded by memories of him. His clothes still hung in the closet, his toothbrush sat next to mine, and the scent of his cologne lingered in the air. It was as if he was still here, yet I couldn't reach him. I often found myself walking through the rooms, touching the things he had left behind, as though trying to grasp at something I had lost. But the more I tried, the more distant he felt. The anger started to build inside me, a slow-burning fire that I couldn't extinguish. I wasn't angry with his death. That was something no one could control. But the will, it felt like a betrayal I couldn't forgive. Why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't he trusted me enough to share his true feelings, to explain why he made that choice? I had been the one by his side, the one who had stood with him through thick and thin. Why did Carol and her family, people who weren't even a part of his life anymore, have a claim to everything? I would often find myself standing by the window, staring out at the world, and I would replay the moments we had shared, searching for answers. Had he always felt this way? Was I simply too blind to see that his past with Carol was something that he couldn't let go of? It was clear to me now that their connection had never truly ended, no matter how much I had hoped it had. Even though we had built a life together, I now realized that part of him had always belonged to her family. The pain of it all seemed insurmountable. I felt like a fool. Here I had been, pouring my heart into a marriage, thinking that we were building something that was ours alone. But now, in the wake of his death, I was left with a haunting sense of insecurity. I wondered if deep down he had always been torn between his past and his present, unable to choose between me and the family that had shaped him. I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in my own life. As much as I tried to hold on to the love we had shared, I couldn't deny the truth that was beginning to emerge. I had been living in a shadow. John's history, his bond with his ex-wife and her family, had always loomed over us. I had been so focused on building our future that I had failed to see how strongly his past had anchored him. It wasn't just the inheritance, it was everything. The way he had always been drawn back to them, the way he had kept parts of his life from me, the way he had kept his promises to them even after we were married. It was as though he couldn't sever the ties that bound him to them. But even with all these realizations, I couldn't bring myself to confront Carol. I couldn't bring myself to ask her why she had been a part of our lives in such an intrusive way. Part of me didn't want to know the truth. I feared that understanding would only make the pain worse. I had already lost John. Confronting his past meant losing the image of him that I had clung to. I spent my days in solitude, replaying conversations we had had, searching for clues, looking for the moment when everything began to unravel. The more I searched, the more I came to the painful realization that I might never get the answers I so desperately sought. John was gone, and with him, any hope of understanding why he had made the choices he did. my thoughts often spiraled into an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls of this house that now felt like a prison. But more than anything, I wanted him back. I wanted to hear his voice, to ask him why he had left everything behind, why he had trusted them over me, why he had never told me about the weight of his past. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I was faced with the stark truth. He was gone, and I was left to carry the burden of this betrayal alone. I had always thought that the hardest part of losing someone would be the absence of their presence. But now, I understood. The hardest part was the unanswered questions, the things left, unsaid, the parts of their life that you would never understand. I wasn't sure how to move forward. The pain was still raw, and the bitterness lingered, refusing to let go. But I knew one thing. If I wanted to find peace, I would have to let go of the need for answers, of the desire to make sense of the things that didn't make sense. I had to learn to accept the reality of what had happened, even if I couldn't fully understand it. Only then could I begin to heal. It was an unusually warm afternoon when I found myself back at the cemetery. The sky above was cloudless, the sun shining down as if the world was oblivious to the turmoil inside me. I hadn't returned to John's grave since the funeral, too consumed by grief and anger to face it again. But today, for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I needed to go. I needed to confront the feelings I had buried deep inside me, the confusion, the pain, the betrayal. As I walked through the rows of graves, the weight of my steps felt heavier than ever. The finality of it all was still so hard to grasp. John was gone, and his absence echoed in every corner of my life. His death had shattered me, but his will, the decision to leave everything to his ex-wife's family, had felt like a wound that would never heal. It was a betrayal that I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to understand it. I had been left in the dark about his true feelings, his reasons, and now I was left to navigate the wreckage of my life without him. When I reached his grave, I stood there in silence, staring at the simple headstone with his name etched in stone. It felt so final. I had spent so many years sharing my life with him, planning our future, only to have everything ripped away in an instant. The pain was unbearable, and as I stood there, tears began to well up in my eyes. But before they could fall, I heard a voice behind me. "Are you okay?" I turned, startled. Standing a few feet away was Carol, John's ex-wife. She was dressed in simple black, her face soft and worn with grief, but there was something in her eyes that was different, something I hadn't expected. She had always been the one I resented, the one I couldn't understand. But now, as I looked at her standing there, something shifted inside me. I couldn't quite place it, but I didn't feel the same anger I once did. I don't know. I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I've been so angry, so hurt. I understand, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of its own. You have every right to be. I didn't know what to say. For so long, I had felt that Carol was the source of all my pain. She had been in John's life before me, and I had always feared she would come between us. Even after we married, there was always a tension, a feeling of competition I couldn't shake. But as I stood there, facing her in the silence of the cemetery, the anger I had held on to for so long began to melt away. "I never wanted to cause you pain," Carol continued, her voice softer now. "John was complicated. He loved you, but he couldn't let go of the past. He tried to make things right in his own way, and sometimes it wasn't the best way." I looked at her, trying to process what she was saying. "What do you mean? Why would he leave everything to you and your family? Why didn't he leave it to me?" Carol took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Because when we divorced, John promised me that he would always be there for our children, and for me in whatever way he could. I didn't want anything from him, not his money or his possessions. But he couldn't let go of the guilt, the feeling that he hadn't done enough. He never really knew how to let go of me or my family, even after everything had changed." The words hit me like a punch. I had never truly understood the depth of John's guilt. I had always thought of him as a man who was fully committed to our life together. But now, in this moment, I realized just how torn he had been. He had never fully let go of his past, of his promises to Carol and her family. And in the end, he had tried to make amends in a way that only caused more pain. "Loved you," Carol said quietly, her gaze meeting mine. "But he didn't know how to show it. He didn't know how to make things right between us and still be with you. It was easier for him to give everything away, to try to fix the past instead of facing it." For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing her words. It was the first time anyone had truly explained it to me. I had been so focused on my own pain, my own betrayal, that I hadn't stopped to think about how John must have felt, how conflicted he had been. "I don't know what to do with all of this," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm so angry, and I don't know how to let go." Carol nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "I understand. It's not easy. But holding on to that anger, that resentment, won't bring him back. And it won't fix anything. If you want to heal, you have to forgive him. And you have to forgive yourself." Her words struck me deeply. I had spent so much time blaming John, blaming Carol, blaming the circumstances, that I had never stopped to consider that I, too, needed to forgive. I needed to let go of the pain, the hurt, the anger that had been poisoning my heart. As I stood there in the cemetery with Carol by my side, something inside me began to shift. The anger wasn't gone. It was still there, lingering beneath the surface. But for the first time since John's death, I felt like I had a way forward. I didn't have to understand everything. I didn't have to get all the answers. But I could choose to forgive, to let go of the weight that had been holding me down. I turned to Carol, my heart heavy but lighter than it had been in weeks. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you for telling me this." She gave me a small, sad smile, He was a complicated man, and I know he hurt you, but he loved you. That's what matters. And for the first time, I believed it. The weeks following my conversation with Carol were difficult, but they brought with them a strange sense of clarity. I still wasn't fully at peace with what had happened, but something had shifted in me. For the first time, I was beginning to see John not as the man I had lost, but as a man with flaws, regrets, and a past that he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. His decision to leave everything to Carol and her family no longer felt like a personal attack on me. It felt like a desperate attempt to fix something broken long before I came into his life. I still struggled with the idea that John had kept so much of his past hidden from me. There were still nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had ever really known him at all. But slowly, I started to make peace with the fact that people, no matter how close they are, carry pieces of themselves that we might never fully understand. The life we shared, the love we built together, had been real, even if it was imperfect. One evening, after dinner, I found myself standing in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through some of John's old photo albums. It was a ritual I had avoided for weeks, too painful to face the images of happier times. But tonight, something inside me urged me to do it. I wanted to remember the man I had loved, not the man who had betrayed me. As I turned the pages, I came across a photograph that took me by surprise. It was a picture of John and Carol, smiling and holding hands at a family picnic. But it wasn't just the picture that caught my attention. It was the inscription on the back. To my first love, Carol, always and forever. The words sent a chill through me. I had never seen this photo before, and I had never known about this inscription. It was a piece of John's past that I had never been told about. Suddenly, all the pieces started to fall into place. The deep connection he had with Carol, the way he had always been tied to her family, the guilt he carried. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. This was about a man who had loved deeply and had never been able to fully let go. I spent the next few hours staring at the photo, trying to make sense of it all. John had loved Carol in a way that I had never understood. Their bond wasn't something that could be erased by time or new relationships. I had always believed that he had chosen me, that I was the one he truly loved. But now, looking at the photo and the words he had written, I realized that part of him had always belonged to her, no matter how much he had tried to move on. The revelation was painful, but it also brought a sense of understanding. John's decision to leave everything to Carol's family wasn't just about money or possessions. It was about his unresolved feelings, his desire to make things right with his past. He had never fully cut ties with that part of his life, and in some ways, I had been blind to that fact. I had been so focused on our present and our future that I had failed to recognize how much of his past still had a hold on him. It hurt to admit, but I knew now that I had never been the only woman in his life. I had always suspected it, but seeing the photo and the inscription confirmed it. The love he had for me was real, but it wasn't the only love he had ever known. And that was a hard truth to accept. The pain of betrayal began to fade as I processed this new understanding. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Carol, not at John, and not at myself. I had spent so much time fighting against something I couldn't change, but now I realized that the only way to move forward was to accept the complexities of his life and our relationship. I still missed John deeply. I still wished that things had been different, that he had made different choices, that he had been able to let go of his past. But I no longer resented him for it. In fact, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. The man I had loved was flawed, yes, but he had also been kind, caring, and deeply human. His mistakes didn't erase the love we had shared. They simply reminded me that love isn't always clean and simple. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it's not enough to heal all the wounds. As I closed the photo album and placed it back on the shelf, I felt a sense of release. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't have the perfect closure I had hoped for. But I had something more valuable: understanding. I had the realization that I could love someone and still not fully know them. That didn't diminish the love I had for John. It simply made me more compassionate, both toward him and toward myself. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely. Not yet. But for the first time, I felt like I could. I could forgive him for his past, for the things he kept hidden, for the way he had left me behind. I could forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to heal. And that was the only way forward. The days following my revelation were filled with a quiet intensity, a lingering weight of both grief and clarity. I had spent so much time resenting John for his decisions, his choice to leave everything to Carol's family, the secrets he had kept from me, the way he had carried the weight of his past. I had spent months drowning in anger, as if my bitterness was the only thing that could keep me connected to him. But now, everything had shifted. I had found an understanding of who he was, of the complexities of his heart, and most importantly, I had learned that the only way to heal was to let go. It wasn't easy, though. Letting go of the anger that had been a constant companion for so long felt like trying to sever a part of myself. For months, I had held on to my hurt, convinced that it was the only thing keeping me grounded. It was as if my pain was my way of holding on to the love I had lost. But now, standing at the crossroads between healing and bitterness, I knew I couldn't continue down the same path. If I wanted to move forward, I had to release my grip on the past. I remember one quiet afternoon, sitting on the couch, staring out the window at the overcast sky. It had been a month since my conversation with Carol, and though I hadn't seen her again, her words echoed in my mind. She had told me that John had loved me, but he had also been deeply tied to his past, and that part of him had never fully let go of it. She had urged me to forgive, not for his sake, but for mine. It wasn't about excusing his choices or forgetting the pain. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment. The truth was, I didn't want to let go. It was easier to stay angry, to hold on to the belief that John had wronged me. It was easier to stay stuck in a place where I could keep blaming him for my pain, to keep him alive in my thoughts as the man who had betrayed me. But I couldn't keep living like that. I realized that my anger wasn't just hurting him. It was hurting me. It was holding me back from the healing I so desperately needed. I took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the room wash over me. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I thought of John not as the man who had betrayed me, but as the man I had loved. I remembered the way he held me in his arms after a long day, the way his laughter filled the house, the way we had built a life together. I remembered the man who had been kind, loving, and full of dreams, even if those dreams hadn't always aligned with mine. I remembered him in his entirety, flaws and all. That was when I realized that I didn't need to carry the burden of anger anymore. I didn't need to hold on to the things that had hurt me. I didn't need to keep punishing myself for the things that were beyond my control. John was gone, and while his past would always be a part of him, it no longer had to define my future. The process of letting go wasn't instantaneous. There were still moments when the bitterness crept back in, when the hurt resurfaced, but they became less frequent. Each time it happened, I reminded myself that forgiveness wasn't a one-time event. It was a process. I would have to choose it every day, choosing to let go of the resentment, choosing to release the pain, and choosing to honor the love I had for him by freeing myself from the emotional weight of his past. One evening, as I stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I whispered a quiet prayer. "I forgive you," I said softly, the words leaving my lips with more difficulty than I had anticipated. "I forgive you for your past, for the secrets you kept, for leaving me with more questions than answers." The words felt heavy, but there was a lightness that followed, as though a weight had been lifted from my chest. The next morning, I took a step I hadn't thought I could. I visited John's grave again, this time with a different intention. I stood there in the quiet, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, and I spoke to him, not with anger or sorrow, but with a sense of peace. "I forgive you, John. I forgive you for everything." I didn't expect an answer, of course. There was no magical moment of closure. But somehow, in that simple act of letting go, I felt a shift within me. The past, with all its pain, no longer had the power to control my future. I wasn't erasing the hurt, but I was choosing not to carry it any longer. For the first time since John's death, I felt free. Not free of the grief, but free of the chains that had bound me to my anger and resentment. I could finally breathe, unburdened by the weight of everything that had happened. I was ready to move forward, to heal, and to honor the love we had shared by choosing to live in the present, rather than being trapped in the past. It had been a few weeks since I had made the decision to forgive John. It wasn't an easy choice, nor had it been an immediate fix, but I could feel the subtle shift inside me. The weight of resentment was gradually lifting, and while I didn't expect everything to change overnight, I had finally taken the first step toward emotional freedom. The pain still lingered, but it wasn't the constant ache it once was. Instead, it had become something I could manage, something I could understand and eventually let go of. But then, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. A phone call. It was an afternoon like any other when the phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea, when the sound of the ring broke through my quiet thoughts. I glanced at the caller ID and saw a name I hadn't expected. Carol. My stomach tightened at the sight. Since our conversation at the graveyard, I hadn't heard from her. Part of me wanted to ignore the call, to avoid any further emotional complexity, but another part of me, perhaps the part that was finally starting to heal, felt compelled to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi." Carol's voice was hesitant, almost strained. "It's Carol. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, and I've made a decision. I need to talk to you." Her words immediately put me on edge. I didn't know what to expect, but I hadn't anticipated her reaching out again, especially after everything that had transpired. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of caution. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her take a deep breath. "I've decided to give you part of what John left behind," she said softly. "I know it's not going to fix everything, but I think it's the right thing to do. You deserve to have something too. I want to make things right." I sat there, stunned, not sure if I had heard her correctly. Part of me wanted to shout, to question why it had taken her this long to come to such a decision. But another part of me, one that had spent the past few weeks letting go of my anger, simply stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. Carol explained that after much thought, she realized that while John had wanted to make amends with his past, he had neglected to consider the impact it would have on me, the woman he had chosen to spend his life with. She admitted that she had been caught up in her own guilt, her own sense of responsibility for John's unresolved emotions. In her mind, she had always felt that she owed him something, and the inheritance had been her way of trying to make up for that. But as the months passed, Carol realized that the best way to honor John's memory wasn't through material possessions. It was through kindness and understanding. She understood now that I had been left in the dark, and while the inheritance couldn't fix the emotional damage, it could help bridge the gap that had been left between us. I took a long breath, processing everything she had said. My emotions were torn. On the one hand, I was grateful for her decision, for her willingness to share what had been left behind. But on the other hand, there was still a part of me that questioned her motives, that wondered why it had taken so long for her to come to this conclusion. Was it guilt? Was it her own way of trying to find redemption? "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice quiet. "I am," she replied, her tone firm now. "I can't undo the past, but I can do something now. I don't expect it to change everything, but I hope it will help you in some way. You deserve to have a part of John's legacy, too." The call ended with a promise to meet in person soon to go over the details of the transfer. As I hung up the phone, I sat in stunned silence. Part of me was overwhelmed with gratitude, while another part felt a lingering sense of confusion. Why hadn't she offered this before? Why had it taken so long for her to realize that I, too, was entitled to a piece of the life I had shared with John? Despite my mixed feelings, something important had changed. The decision to give me part of the inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about acknowledging my place in John's life, and in a way, it was a step toward healing for both of us. It was Carol's way of saying that she saw me, not just as John's wife, but as someone who had been deeply impacted by his death, by his choices, and by the pain he had left behind. The unexpected change wasn't just in the inheritance. It was in the way I had begun to see Carol, not as the woman who had stolen part of my husband's heart, but as a woman who, like me, had suffered through her own share of heartbreak. And in a strange way, I began to feel a sense of compassion for her. We were both just women trying to navigate the complex web of love, loss, and guilt. I knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. Healing wasn't something that could be solved by a transfer of wealth, but it was a start, a step toward understanding, forgiveness, and the possibility of moving forward, not just with my life, but with a new perspective on the past. The weeks that followed Carol's unexpected call were filled with a mixture of emotions. My life had shifted so much in such a short time. I had come to terms with John's death, forgiven him for the secrets he kept, and let go of the anger that had consumed me for months. Carol's decision to share part of the inheritance, though unexpected, felt like the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. It wasn't about the money. It was about the acknowledgement of my place in John's life, and that gesture, no matter how small it seemed, felt like a balm to my aching heart. I had spent years building a life with John, one that was filled with love, laughter, and shared dreams. But in the end, that life had been overshadowed by the complexity of his past with Carol. The inheritance had been a symbol of that, a final reminder of the bond he had shared with her family and the guilt he carried with him until the day he died. But Carol's decision to give me part of what was left behind was her way of recognizing that I, too, had been a part of John's story. She acknowledged that our relationship, our life together, was just as important as his past. It was a gesture of compassion, one that made me realize how far I had come in my own emotional journey. I had spent so much time focusing on what I had lost, but now I was starting to see what I still had. Memories of the love John and I had shared, the moments that were ours alone, and the future I still had ahead of me. The inheritance was symbolic. Yes, but it was also the closure I hadn't realized I needed. When we met in person to finalize the transfer, I saw Carol in a new light. She wasn't just the ex-wife who had come between us, the one who had taken a place in John's heart that I felt should have been mine. She was a woman who, like me, had suffered the loss of someone she had once loved. She had been left with questions, with regrets, with a complex relationship to a man who was no longer there. And, in her own way, she was trying to make amends for the hurt that had been left in the wake of his passing. We sat down in a quiet cafe, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Neither of us knew exactly what to say, but there was a calm understanding between us now. The walls that had once existed between us, the resentment, the bitterness, the competition, were gone. "I know this doesn't fix everything," Carol said softly, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "But I hope it helps in some way. I've thought about this a lot, and I know it was wrong of me to take so long. I just didn't know how to move forward either." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at her, not at John. I had come to understand that love, in its truest form, wasn't always simple. It was messy, complicated, and full of imperfections. John had loved me, but he had also loved Carol, and that was something I had struggled to accept for so long. But now I realized that both of us had been affected by his love in different ways. "I understand," I said quietly. "It's been hard, but I think I've come to terms with it. I've been holding on to anger for so long, and it wasn't helping me. I've realized that I can't change what happened, but I can choose to let go of the bitterness." Carol smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a sense of relief. "I'm glad to hear that. I don't want to be the person who caused more pain. I want us both to heal in our own way." As we finalized the paperwork for the inheritance transfer, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The money wasn't important. It never had been. What mattered was the emotional healing, the understanding, and the closure that had finally come. Carol's gesture wasn't just about giving me something material. It was about offering me a piece of the past that I could finally accept and move on from. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of the house, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I had lost John, but in many ways, I had found myself again. I had found the strength to forgive, to let go of the past, and to heal from the wounds that had once felt insurmountable. I had learned that the only way to move forward was to release the pain, to understand the complexities of love, and to embrace the possibility of peace. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I was no longer defined by my grief or my anger. I was defined by the choices I had made to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer controlled me. As I closed my eyes that night, I whispered a final goodbye to John, not in anger, but in acceptance. And for the first time, I felt truly free.